Okay, well, in the interest of time and everybody who's joined us on time, I want to welcome everybody to the September meeting of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. And I want to thank Mark Quam, who is our Secretary Treasurer. He's our Zoom master, is providing the Zoom account for us to use today. Also want to mention that this program is being recorded and we would expect to have it posted on our website sometime soon. Our website is westwisconsinrail.org. And then I will remind you to keep your audio muted so that we don't have any extra noise during the program. Zoom is a great thing to use, and sometimes we forget to mute and sometimes we don't unmute. So we'll try to keep all of that in mind. My name is Scott Rogers. I'm currently the chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that was actually formed by community leaders in West Central Wisconsin in the late 90s. It includes Wisconsin communities along the corridor between Eau Claire and the Twin Cities. Initially, the organization was formed to get our region included in state and national planning for future passenger rail service, including things like the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative. More recently, we've been working to foster a public-private partnership to establish a multi-frequency corridor on the Union Pacific between Eau Claire, Menominee, Baldwin, Hudson, and St. Paul, Minneapolis. And we also have long-term plans. We'd like to see service east to Milwaukee and Chicago. One other thing that is important to our region is within the last few months, we started the formation of something called the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission, which includes the 3 counties along the line in Wisconsin, as well as 6 municipalities to work towards establishment of passenger rail service. We're not going to spend time on those and those initiatives today. We don't have a lot of new updates since last time. Really, today's program, I think, is going to be a treat for all of us. We're going to have a conversation with Rick Harnish, who is the executive director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. We're going to have a discussion on the current prospects for the growth of passenger rail in the country and, of course, in our region. And we think this will be a timely conversation given federal federal legislation that's pending in Washington and a number of other developments around the country that are leading towards the prospects for expansion of passenger rail service. We will have a Q&A at the end, but I will point out the chat now, because if you do have questions as we go along, put them in the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on that. Likely we may wait till the end to get to some of the questions because we have a fair amount of information we want to cover today and want to make sure that we get through that. So this is not the first time that Rick Harnish has joined us. In fact, he was with us on a Zoom program earlier this year in February. You can see our website if you want to look at the YouTube video of that. Again, it's westwisconsinrail.org. And if you look at the menu choices, you will find meeting videos, one of those, and you can see that in other previous meetings. Actually, Rick, the first time we met was in Tomah, because you spoke to this organization quite a few years ago when we were sort of just getting the ball rolling on some of our initiatives. And I picked you up on the Empire Builder and you spoke the next day. We are still in our region, even though we have a strong population. We still have to travel to Tomah, La Crosse, Red Wing, or St. Paul if we want to ride a scheduled passenger train. And we're working on making regular service available to us. So first of all, Rick, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's start out. We have quite a range of folks on the call today. Lots of people from our region, even some from farther away. A few who have, as recently as this week, joined our organization. And so, could you maybe start out by telling us what is the High Speed Rail Alliance?
Yeah, I will do that. But I first want to point out, I had an interesting experience. I don't think it was on that trip. I think it was on a later trip where I actually just went to Tomah, where I was on a car full of Amish. And I started thinking, I think we're close to Tomah. And it was like being on a subway where before the announcement's made, everybody gets up in the car to get out of the car. So they had not made the announcements that we were pulling in yet, and everybody stood up and got ready. And that just told me that, that train was incredibly valuable to that community because they used it all the time, right? And we need to capture a lot more of that across the country. But the High Speed Rail Alliance is a nonprofit. We're based in Chicago. We're supported by our members. And our members are folks who want to either have the benefit, personal benefit of riding the train, the enjoyment of riding the train, or they represent communities that recognize that they will be much stronger economically if they take the train. And so, we help simplify what the issues are. We want to be the most knowledgeable outside source of what high-speed rail is and how to make it happen. And we give our members the tools they need to educate people either in Madison or in Washington, D.C.
And I might mention, if you want to bring it up now, Rick, you've been expanding and you have a new staff member who's actually based in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so Chris Ott, who is based in Madison, just joined us as deputy director. And we're really excited about that. And that gives us the opportunity, because of his connections in Madison, to really start increasing our level of activity in Wisconsin. And, let's get a good state rail plan that has some money behind it.
All right. Well, we're going to look forward to working with Chris. And if you have depending on how you have your Zoom arranged, he just waved to the camera a moment ago. So he's on the call with us this morning. Rick, Rick, following up on your comment, my last Amtrak trip actually was just last week. My wife and some friends and I spent some time in Milwaukee, and we took the train from Milwaukee to Toma on Tuesday the 7th, and actually our car was about a third filled with Amish folks who got off at Toma. And I have rarely gotten on or off the train there where I haven't had folks from that community utilizing the service. So that's an important connection for them. So speaking of connections for rail, a lot of people, when they find out we're interested in rail, that sort of thing, they really ask the question, well, why should we invest in this? What are the benefits to a community of having passenger rail?
So first of all, it means a lot better connectivity because it allows people to travel more often, more productively, and more safely. It means that communities who have trains and connecting buses are much more attractive places to locate, which means in a lot of cases, if you have the right kind of service, people who might think they have to move to a Chicago or a Minneapolis to get the kind of position that they want, maybe they can stay where they are and just use the train to access those facilities when they need to. The other is, we have in this country really spent a lot of money on focusing on the single driver, getting places fast, safely. And in that process, we've really damaged our communities. And trains can be a catalyst for getting back to safer communities that are more walkable and more financially viable. Currently, our current highway structure is making it difficult for small cities to be financially viable.
Have we seen any progress on that, Rick? Are there any smaller cities who actually have started to benefit when they have had passenger rail service in their communities?
Well, certainly, the places that have had it are really value it very highly. There's a specific example with the Macomb, Illinois. We led a coalition that got Amtrak service doubled to Macomb. I hate to say it was way back in 2006, but it was. And immediately the number of parking permits that students were requesting plummeted because they didn't feel they needed their car to get home to Chicago once in a while. So the cost of providing parking to students went down.
And for those that don't know, Macomb is where Western Illinois University is, and a smaller city, but really depends on their rail passenger service. And just as we've looked around too, we've seen what's happened in the Normal Bloomington area, which is has a lot of characteristics of our area, where it's a medium-sized city with a state university and multiple frequency train service. And they've seen a lot of economic development there as well, as I understand.
Absolutely. It's the downtown is completely unrecognizable from when I started going there in 2000, for the much better. And it's all focused around a new train station and additional frequency.
But we wanted to really touch base today, Rick. You've been at this for a while, and some of us have as well, to really look at the current state of rail passenger advocacy. And a lot of that has to do with the federal legislation right now. And my day job, and actually part of what I'm doing today, is I'm the Vice President of Governmental Affairs at the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce. And so I pay attention to government every day and get immersed in it. It's still hard for me to keep up with everything. But a lot of us have heard about the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, reauthorization, potential federal support, the Amtrak Connexus plan. How do we make sense of all that? Where are we, Rick? First of all, maybe in your optimism about the state of passenger rail advocacy today, and what should we be paying attention to in Washington right now?
Well, I tell you, I set Dylan, one of our program manager, on the case of creating a flow chart to show how all this legislation was moving. And it's a complete mess, and we still haven't quite figured it out. The challenge is that, there's regular order. And the way they say things work is there's an authorization that lasts maybe multiple years that sets the policy and it sets the spending limits. That the transportation authorization expires on September 30th. So there's that. Then there's the annual appropriation, which has to happen every year. And that's where Congress actually decides how much money they're going to spend. That also expires on September 30th. So you've got those processes kind of going through the committee structure through this past year. And there's no way they're hitting those deadlines at this point. In addition to that, there's this bipartisan infrastructure bill, which included really good money for passenger train development and transit. And then there's a separate budget reconciliation. And the question is, if those pass by September 30th, does that override the need for the other two? We don't know. So it has been a complicated process. The good news is there's substantial money in there for a variety of programs that will benefit passenger trains in the state of Wisconsin. The key is to make sure that the drumbeat keeps rolling as the final sausage is getting made in the back rooms over the next several weeks, so that money doesn't get cut. And that's our current challenge.
So just what's there then? What's in we hear about the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has passed the Senate, it's in the House now. What can you tell us about that, and why should we perhaps be excited about it?
Well, I've got this chart that we put together in the late August, which needs updated as of this week, just to show you how things are constantly changing. But this is the money that was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has had many names. The first of it was BIF, for framework instead of bill. But at this point, the Northeast Corridor is getting $30 billion, either through direct Amtrak or a pot of money called State of Good Repair that the states could compete for. And that would all have to go to the Northeast Corridor. So that's less interesting to us than this other stuff. The next piece is Amtrak, just for its general use, is appropriated $16 billion. And this is probably over 5 years. State of Good Repair, which gets modified so that you can actually use it for expansion. But that's $12 billion. CRISI is an overall program that you can build a lead into a factory with this funds, or you could build a new bridge for high-speed rail or new electrification for high-speed rail. Chrissy can, anything for railroads can go into Chrissy. And then we believe there should be a strong focus on eliminating grade crossings. So we're glad that there's a program specifically for not necessarily eliminating them, but making them safer. We were concerned that the high-speed and intercity passenger rail fund was not funded, and that's where you're really focused on expansion. And so we were asking for 20 billion to be added into that program in the reconciliation. And then these other programs down here, certainly transit, we viewed high-speed rail and airlines as part of the transit network. It's unfortunate that the money is split up in so many different ways, but we're glad that there's a big pot of money for transit. And then there's a couple of programs that railroads can go after that are also for highways programs. So this is really good news. The bill that just passed through the T&I committee yesterday, well, it was technically yesterday, but it was in the early wee morning, has 10 billion in Prime, which is a new program, but that Prime program points to the high-speed rail program for how it's governed. And so that's another huge step. And that is focused on trains that with new infrastructure would go 186 miles an hour or above, or on existing infrastructure, 160 miles an hour or above. And you know, Amtrak is targeting 160 miles an hour for the Northeast Corridor. So this is really exciting progress. But again, it's a moving target, and we got to keep the drumbeat going as they decide the final process.
So when we hear about Rick, the 66 billion, then the first two categories you showed there, they're the ones that make up that figure.
Absolutely.
Bipartisan bill.
Yeah.
And then the T&I committee that you mentioned yesterday, that would be the committee in the House of Representatives, and that would be the reconciliation bill. Is that right?
And yeah, and the normal process of each house works on a bill and then they come together in the end is not happening with this bill. And so different committees in each house are working on different pieces, and they hope to have the whole thing come together as a single bill in the end. It's going to be really challenging.
So there's really two vehicles that are the primary vehicles we're looking at, just sort of clarify for people. One is the bipartisan infrastructure bill that did pass the Senate. It had 69 votes, which was a fairly significant margin. It has not passed the House yet. And Rick, what are you hearing about the prospects of it being approved and going into law?
Well, again, this is challenging because key members of the House leadership have said that it won't get passed if the other reconciliation bill doesn't get passed. And again, that adds another layer of complexity to this whole process. So I think the chances are pretty good, but you're not going to want to watch the process for the next couple of weeks because it's going to be ugly.
Right. And for those kind of watching what happens in Congress, the House is really the place to keep an eye on for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's a group of moderates and business groups and others who are advocating for investment in infrastructure, who are saying, let's just pass that Senate bill, get the president to sign it, and then the infrastructure, or then the reconciliation bill can stand on its own and be a separate discussion. That one is, as with Rick referring to them still marking it up, they came up with a number, and then they assigned dollars to each committee in the House to come up with their legislation, which is the T&I you mentioned. But they also have to get, and that would be the kind of bill that would only pass, is likely only to pass with Democratic votes, which would mean they need the 50 votes in the Senate plus the vice president, and passing it by their very narrow, they only have a 3-seat majority in the House. But you have moderate Democrats in the Senate, particularly Joe Manchin, who say, right now, I'm not going to vote for a bill that large. And so there is a lot of give and take between the Senate and the House on that bill. And so part of the discussion when they moved forward on the reconciliation bill in the House, the moderate Democrats who want to see the infrastructure bill passed did get a promise from, actually in the rule that was passed from Speaker Pelosi, to have a vote by September 27th on the infrastructure bill. So that'll be a date to watch and to see if that actually happens. And if the House would pass the Senate bill, that would go to the president and it would be signed. So it's a moving target right now. And so you could say, well, we are talking about something we're not sure about. But Rick, maybe to put all this in context, you said you looked at those numbers and you said this is mostly good news. So what is the context here? How much different is the landscape today than it was, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, 3 or 4 years ago, trying to do math, yes, 4 years ago, we had a governor who had tried to kill the rail program here in Illinois, not in its entirety, but that caused a lot of delay. So it made it very difficult to talk about the things we needed to do to have progress while that was happening. And we certainly had, at best, what could be called foot dragging at the federal level. So we're in a point now where people are actually talking about expansion and talking about appropriating money for expansion. So we're in a completely different place now than we were even a year ago. And we really need to maintain this momentum.
So we've talked about the federal legislation. We haven't actually, I don't know if we've even uttered the word Amtrak yet, but one of the things that made some news, it was right after the president announced his ideas, which included $80 billion for passenger rail, or for rail anyway. And Amtrak came up with something they called the Amtrak Connects Us plan. And in fact, there was some interest in this area because it actually included our corridor as part of the overall development of the Twin Cities to Chicago corridor. And in fact, just this week, Rick, on your Twitter account, you said 50 years since Amtrak was founded, the US's federally owned passenger operator is arguably at the most exciting juncture in its history. So is that true? What is this Connects Us program, and what's exciting about Amtrak these days?
Well, so I've got the map here. So what they did, which, we're really excited that Amtrak went through and created an expansion program or a proposal. And then they went out and sold it to Congress. That's exciting. And you've got yellow here on this map is improvements to existing services. And then blue is additional services. And so they said, if you give us this much money, we will do a program like this. I don't think they ever intended it to be the last word. It was just, let's have a discussion about what could happen. And so, yeah, there's substantial improvements here for Wisconsin, with Eau Claire being on the map, adding Madison, Green Bay, and Superior. So this would be a fantastic first step. The interesting thing is that Amtrak didn't get the majority of the money. The majority of the money went into state programs. So the states will have a lot to say about what improvements actually come out of these funds. And there's an opportunity to say, well, Amtrak proposes this, we like this, but we would like this more, or, we'll put some money in and we'll do this, or, so it's really up to the states to be very aggressive about going after this money. And, with all the work that Tommy Thompson did, that stuff is still sitting there and could be taken advantage of to really do something really cool in Wisconsin.
So what is your understanding, Rick, about how Amtrak would implement this? They've talked about paying the cost up front, or is that still kind of just part of the discussion as to how this might actually happen?
That's really part of it's not set in stone yet. And because the bigger pieces of the money actually are on the state competitive grant side as opposed to the Amtrak side, the states have a much bigger role than under what Amtrak was proposing.
So to bring people up to speed on that, and you mentioned Wisconsin, our DOT actually has been particularly successful at getting existing grants, the Chrissy grants that you mentioned earlier that already exist, which would be substantially increased and augmented under some of the new legislation. So we actually have one of the new services that's blue on that line is actually now been funded and should be happening in 2 to 3 years, the TCMC. What can you tell us about that?
So, that's been a long process to get there. We're really excited that the communities in Minnesota worked so hard to get that, in addition to the communities in Wisconsin. It's a good step towards making this service much more viable. And I'm looking forward to riding that train in a couple of years.
And to bring people up to speed on that, if you are familiar with the current service across Wisconsin, the Empire Builder for what comes from the West Coast, it comes in at St. Paul, travels down the west side of the river to the other side through Winona and Red Wing, crosses at La Crosse, then goes through Toma. That's the train we talked about taking onto Milwaukee and Chicago. And under this plan, which has now been funded with funds from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Amtrak, and some of these federal grants, they will be adding a train that's strictly a St. Paul to Chicago train. In fact, it's an extension of one of the current Chicago to Milwaukee Hiawatha frequencies, of which there are 7 now. And Wisconsin has been particularly successful getting Chrissy grants, not only for that, but also for improvements on the Chicago to Milwaukee line, which they're hoping to expand. One thing Wisconsin's already done, and worth mentioning, is added 2 direct connection buses that go right from the train to the Fox Valley. So that'd be Fond du Lac, Appleton, and Green Bay, and Oshkosh. And we've had a run row from WISDOT on our discussions here. It's actually in our YouTube page if you want to go back and look at it. And they're also envisioning some of these specific connections to places that are not directly on the line, like Madison and Rochester, as well as a Toma to Eau Claire bus. For those that don't want to have to drive to Toma or aren't able to drive, you'd be able to buy a ticket in Eau Claire. It would include your shuttle connection to Toma and then onto Milwaukee or Chicago or wherever you might be going. So that has now been fully funded, and they're working on the implementation. So we're looking forward to that. So Rick, you're the High Speed Rail Alliance. So what do you mean by high speed rail? And here we are mostly talking about conventional trains. So what is the difference? What are all these definitions?
Well, trains are incredibly versatile, right? They're like Legos, where you can put different pieces together in different ways, depending upon what your assets are, your existing assets, what your needs are, and how much gumption you have to make a big difference, right? So high-speed rail doesn't stand on its own. It's part of a network of many other things that high-speed rail brings the juice to, right? So in its basic core, it's new tracks built like an interstate highway, 0 grade crossings, and trains going 200 miles an hour or faster. So that's the core that makes everything else work well. And then it's lots of connecting services, and sometimes those high-speed trains actually go off into different places off of the main line. So you can't do one without the other, and we have to figure out how to have master plans at the regional level that say, well, here we're going to do this kind of infrastructure, there we're going to do this kind of infrastructure, et cetera. So that's kind of, it's not a simple definition of what high-speed rail is, but hopefully that makes some sense.
So I might ask, your organization, you were instrumental, as you mentioned a few years ago, in getting Illinois to increase its intercity rail program, which most of it isn't high-speed rail, although we have seen faster speeds on the Chicago to St. Louis line. And sometimes we hold up Illinois as an example, at least. Sometimes in Wisconsin, of course, we have this competitive relationship with Illinois. And sometimes we say good things about Illinois, and sometimes we say bad things, and we want everybody to move to Wisconsin, of course. But one of the things Illinois does have is its passenger rail program. And sometimes we do hold that up because many, not all, but many of the cities like we have in Wisconsin, like your Eau Claire's, Madison, Green Bay, if we were cities in Illinois, we probably would already have passenger rail service, although that's not entirely true. Can you tell us a little bit about the Illinois program and what's good about it?
So back when Amtrak was being formed, a number of downstate communities fought real hard to keep service as part of the Amtrak network. They weren't successful, unfortunately. Decatur was one of them that fought really hard, and then the other, the string of communities, Macomb and Galesburg, et cetera. But what they did do was shortly after Amtrak was formed, and they did that big bloodletting, the state did start paying for service to Macomb and Quincy. And so that was the most important first step, was actually creating this program to expand. We've also got the advantage of Metra being a really important passenger railroad in the state. And so, there's a need to continue funding passenger railroads in the state. We also were benefited from the map. So because there was so little service left, the places that had decent connections to other places got service on railroads that were in good shape. So Green Bay kind of sitting out there on its own wasn't it wasn't on a longer route. But the key is that in the mid 2000s, a group of mayors and other local leaders from around the state got together and pushed a program to expand Amtrak service. And the deal was that if Rockford, for example, pushed better service to Springfield, the second round, there would be money for expansion to Rockford and the Quad Cities. And then, those mayors again worked together to get a $500 million plus or minus, I'm forgetting the number, for passenger rail expansion that included Rockford and the Quad Cities. And then because that coalition was so strong, when Governor Rauner came in and tried to kill the program, they stood up and said, no, we have to keep this program. So the key lesson here is it's the local communities working together to fight for a statewide program. And that can be hard because the mayor of Champaign has strong competition with the mayor of Normal or mayor of Bloomington, and you got to get them to say at the same time, we're going to get better service for both of us. So you've got to figure out how to do that for La Crosse and Eau Claire and Green Bay all at the same time.
Right. So we're on the same page with La Crosse. We think we both need passenger rail service. So we want to continue with that. So what's the future in Illinois? I think there's some new things being talked about too.
So we persuaded the legislature to create a commission to create a statewide plan. And the level, most of the states have a state rail plan. There are some that are just so disinterested that they don't have one, but most of them have it. But most of them, they're kind of milquetoast, or in the case of Illinois, it's a long list of kind of more of a wish list than a plan. And they include true high-speed rail between Chicago and St. Louis in that list. California is the first state to take a comprehensive view of the whole network and go out to 2040 and say, this is how the network is going to work together. This is the schedule of buses that's going to meet trains at these stations. These conventional trains will meet high-speed rail at these stations at these times. They plan on having a single ticket for the entire state, etc. And because of that, they can work backwards and say, this is what we have to do today to have this happen in 2040. And it more than doubles the amount of usage because you're coordinating the system instead of having individuals. So we hope that this new commission will strive for that kind of plan and get to actual implementation. And for Wisconsin, you can't do Illinois right without including Wisconsin in the mix. So this really can be the catalyst for really thinking much bigger about what we're going to do in the Midwest. And it's really exciting that this is moving forward.
All right, we do have a couple more topics we want to get to, but I will remind you that if you have any questions as we go along, go ahead and enter them in the chat, and we'll try to get some time before we adjourn at 9 to cover any questions. I'm going to ask you one more question, Rick, just sort of about the types of service, and clearly the interest of the High-Speed Rail Alliance is more than just the trains that are 200 miles an hour. Sometimes we hear people who talk about high-speed rail say, you know, if we weren't losing all this money on these long distance trains across the country, we could have high-speed rail. I do remember that when Amtrak seemed to want to get out of the long distance service a few years ago, your organization was actually in the forefront advocating for continuation of long distance service. So what's your perspective on maintaining long distance trains and even expanding that service?
I think that the long distance trains are the foundation on which everything else builds. And, you know, there was a previous president of Amtrak who testified before Congress that the trains covered their avoidable costs, right? So the cost of running that system is not that much. What gets tricky is how you allocate overhead. And there's a lot of overhead in this system that, you know, you can allocate in various ways. What really is needed is to double the frequencies at least so that every town has daylight service. That's number one. Number two, the core problem that we have in this country doesn't get solved by stopping those trains. The core problem is that the railroads don't see passenger trains as a viable business. And, you know, weapons of mass destruction is a viable business. It's paid for entirely by by our taxes, right? But it's a viable business. So we need to figure out how to make the railroads think that passenger trains are a viable business. And that problem exists whether the train's going 2,000 miles or it's only going 50 miles. There's the core problem we have to fix. And that doesn't get fixed by suddenly taking hundreds of communities out of the mix.
We also want to talk a little bit, Rick, about, we've talked about Amtrak and sort of that as an avenue for expansion of passenger rail service. But for those who have been looking around and seeing what's happening around the country, and in fact, the public-private partnership concept we've been working on locally, one of the most prominent is Brightline in Florida. And then there's also a private venture in Texas that's working on a high-speed rail between Dallas and Houston. Can you tell us about those efforts, whether we think we might see more of those, and do they have a role in expansion of passenger rail?
We need to go back to the definition of high-speed rail, right? So there are trains and there's track, and you can have multiple kinds of trains running on different kinds of track. But the three types of track, to keep it simple, are shared use, where you've got really long, heavy freight trains sharing tracks with passenger trains. Then there's regional, where you're taking existing lines, probably putting them into public ownership and getting them focused on fast, frequent passenger trains. The Northeast Corridor is a regional line. And then high-speed lines are where you're building it completely from scratch, with zero grade crossings to go faster than 125, preferably faster than 160. So Brightline is doing a shared use line from Miami to Cocoa with the Florida East Coast. That was a deal put together because the ostensible owner of the parent company of the freight railroad and the land really wanted it to happen. So he created a passenger railroad. And because they were all in the same corporate family, you could negotiate how all of these different interests came together. And they did, they figured it out. And so you can run frequent passenger trains at 80, 110 miles an hour on that line. It's too bad that that deal is a privately held deal, because it's probably the answer for figuring out what happens with BNSF and UP. But they found a unique market with a unique real estate circumstance, but they're leading the way to how we do this in other places. Dallas to Houston was based on the Japanese wanting to get a foothold here in the United States. They did extensive market research in the US. Illinois bubbled to the top as a potential place to start high-speed rail. They decided that Dallas to Houston was the most viable for many reasons. They've gone through some fights, and hopefully they'll be going in front of the STB soon. But that, again, is an incredibly unique situation, and there's a land deal at each end. And then Brightline in Nevada is the same thing. There's the station will be part of a big real estate deal in Las Vegas, and then they figured out how to put the high-speed tracks in the interstate right-of-way to avoid the right-of-way issues. Very exciting project. If they get trains running to Palmdale, and California gets the high-speed trains running from Merced to Bakersfield, now all of a sudden you can talk to private funders about getting across the Tehachapi, because there's a huge market from Northern California and the Central Valley to Las Vegas.
So that leads us into a couple of questions, Rick. One is the potential role of private capital in all of this. And you mentioned the real estate. Does that have a lot more potential when you see real estate development around frequent service passenger train stations that can help support future service development, like Brightline is doing kind of as a self-contained operation?
Well, so the key is who makes money from the real estate deal. And if the city doesn't own it, and if the railroad doesn't own it, now you've got a challenge. Here in Chicago, we financed a multi-billion-dollar expansion of the Red Line and the Brown Line through what we call, it's not a transit TIF, it's something else, but it's funded by the increase in real estate value on a circle around each station. So that is one mechanism that you could use.
Yeah, and I think one of the terms for that is value capture, and that's being looked at really in all modes of transportation, even highways and transit and others.
Which is interesting, because highways typically destroy value of land, but
right. The other thing to comment on is the relationship with the freight railroads. The true high-speed rail that you talked about, where you're building separated rights of way, and that's exclusively for the service, but you talked about shared usage, and that's most of the passenger rail service in the country right now is shared usage. It's Amtrak running on private freight railroads. And we've had some discussion about that. There has been concern about on-time performance for Amtrak, or even access to certain lines. Some of the current legislation that's being considered would tighten that and give Amtrak additional rights in those respects, I believe. You've also talked about that issue and making freight railroads a partner. What's your perspective on the role of freight railroads in shared usage passenger rail development?
Well, so keep in mind that we are subsidizing driving in incredibly complex ways to the tunes of billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars every year. So if you were a private company competing with that as your main competitor, you wouldn't invest that much in long-term infrastructure. So that's what's been happening for 50 years. The railroad industry has been declining for 50 years. They continue to focus on fewer and fewer main lines. And so there's a lot of freight that's moving by truck today that we would be much better off if it was moving on railroads. So the problem is bigger than just passenger trains. The problem is this country is not maintaining or investing in railroad infrastructure at the level it should. So, you know, passing laws that say that the railroads have to run more passenger trains doesn't solve that basic problem. We've got to get to the core problem or solve the core problem of how are we going to build tracks so that more freight and more people can ride on trains. And the real issue, and it really comes down to, you know, thinking differently about how we're doing transportation and thinking more about the road levels at the local level and fixing some of the huge damage we did with road improvements in downtown cities, big and small. But so getting back to your question, we have to think about how to make the money men in New York think that running passenger trains is a good idea if we're really going to get good nationwide service.
We're getting some good discussion or questions in the chat, and we'll go to that in just a minute. But before we do that, Rick, we want to pick up again on what this might look for Wisconsin. If we talked a little bit about the TCMC expansion and other things, but you really are based in Chicago. You started out working on the Midwest, and what are your thoughts on if we move in some of these directions, the additional federal investment, localities and states saying this is important to us, following some of your advice as far as building networks, what would that mean to us here in Wisconsin?
Well, first, I want to point out that this is available publicly, but it's not final. The FRA has done a study of the core network, right? So I want to be clear, as we talked about, high-speed rail is the core, and then you've got all this stuff coming around it. But they will release this study fairly soon that demonstrates that the Midwest is a great place for high-speed rail, and the Chicago to St. Paul line is the best place in the Midwest to start with building high-speed rail. And so even if, let's skip here. So if we take this down to the Wisconsin level, there's all of these bus lines here that would see improvement if you could get from Chicago to Milwaukee, say in 45 minutes to 60 minutes. And if you're only going 80 or 90 miles an hour to Green Bay, you're still making competitive service there because you're going really fast down here. Same thing with Madison. If you've got more people coming into Green Bay by train, they're more likely to take a bus to Menominee or Wausau, right? If you can get the high-speed tracks as far as this junction point, and is that Camp Douglas? Then you've got multiple routes here that could all feed into that. And Eau Claire is sitting on a railroad that's fantastic for fast service. And so again, working with the Union Pacific, what do you want to double track this and maybe, God forbid, electrify it so that we can be on this network? I don't know what the final answer is. There's different ways of doing it. But to get there, you really have to have a statewide coalition pushing the legislature to say, we're going to do public transit across the state. Because again, if more people are coming into Wausau by bus, maybe, something like Uber works a lot better in that town, which then improves that town local transit, et cetera. So there's really exciting opportunities in Wisconsin if we can get folks in Minnesota and Chicago to work together on putting together a statewide plan. Not sure that's really the answer to your question, but hopefully that's a good start.
No, I think, give us a little bit of a vision, talk about where we might be going, because you want a destination and we'll have to get there incrementally, but it does seem like we're hearing from you that there are some things aligning that could be leading us in that direction. So I
And I want to emphasize, it does need to be incrementally, but we need to think about the sizes of the increments, right? And our biggest problem in the Midwest is our increments have been too small. And we haven't had the force then to push them through to completion.
All right, let's we've got about 9 or 10 minutes left, so let's go to what's in the chat. And actually, we're pleased to have with us on the call today Dave Strohmeyer. And if you haven't heard his name, he chairs the multi-county commission in Montana that really recently started working to restore the long distance service through southern Montana, which was discontinued in the late 70s, really because of politics and a short federal budget that year. I way oversimplified that, but they are, of course, disappointed that the Amtrak Connects Us plan does not include any long distance expansion. And maybe he just has their website, kind of brings this up to speed. Rick, do you see anything in the federal legislation that could lead towards some expansion of long distance trains?
So that, yes. So that all the money can be competed for by states. And so the state of Montana could compete for some money to do some track work that would allow additional frequencies. The rolling stock is the biggest issue. You know, Amtrak right now is running a lot of antiques that should have been put to pasture a long time ago. So the primary focus for the long distance needs to be on really expanding the fleet. And the mayors need to work on really getting Amtrak to think differently about those services, and thinking about them again as important rural connectors, and getting the trains to have more seats and more beds so that you can have lower ticket prices.
All right, we have a question from Keeley. And that is the state programs that might receive federal dollars for things like transit and rail. Will those funds also be able to be used for related facilities in communities like train depots, shuttles, parking facilities, et cetera, or they only really fund the rail lines and the trains?
There is a program in the transit side that starts working on that. I'm sorry, I don't understand what their intention is yet, but it's under it's called a housing program, but it's really about connecting transit to housing.
Okay. I do think, Rick, too, that, and again, a lot of these things have been thrown out there, so you don't always know which ones made it in the final bill that's been passed. I know that there is some subsidized debt funding that did not make nearby development eligible. And I think I had understood there was some language in one of these bills to make it more possible to do facilities. And the program is at the tip of my tongue and I can't think of it, but it's a program that has lots of money in it and it's been rarely used because it's been too restrictive in how you can use it. I don't know if you remember which one I'm talking about. Maybe that's the one you mentioned.
So no, that's the RIF.
Yeah.
And it is a loan program like TIFIA, which is another loan program for transportation. And you're right, it's not structured very well to be used. And I know that there was lots of talk about making real estate deals around train stations part of that. My previous mayor, Emmanuel, worked real hard on that. But I'm not sure, again, whether it made it in or is on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, we'll have to ask some questions about that. From Taylor, the question, Rick, how would you pitch high-speed rail or rail in general to a suburban Republican?
Well, it depends upon how close, and every person is different, right? But I want to go back to, and again, I apologize that some of these experiences were a while ago, but when we started off new, I had a new lobbyist right out of college, law school, that was, I was his first client. And all of the support for Amtrak service was coming from Republican legislators. because Republican districts are the ones who are suffering the most from this disconnected way of doing transportation. And so we got some Republicans to introduce a bill to expand Amtrak service. And guess what? It didn't move anywhere because we're a Democratic state. So we learned that lesson. We've got to start thinking about, in that district, what kind of challenge are they having with transportation, and how will transit help with that challenge? And again, airplanes are public transit, right? And a lot of people push for big expansion programs on on airplanes. They're public transit. We just put billions of dollars into them. And now in this infrastructure bill, we're going to put billions of dollars into subsidizing the actual construction of airplanes. So it's more about that specific representative saying, how would that representative benefit from this specific network, and finding people in his district that would support that.
Maybe I should ask the question the way it gets asked sometimes, Rick. We pay gas taxes, and that pays for the highways. And so why, and the trains and transit all lose money. So why should we subsidize those forms when they lose money like that?
The idea that highways are paid for entirely with gas taxes is complete fantasy. It's never, ever been true. And we have, in the process of changing our cities, again, with huge subsidies, changing our cities in a way that has made them financially unviable. And most of our cities are going bankrupt because of the driving. And then you've got these more subtle things like parking requirements, where I was looking at a condo in California. The cost of parking is built into the cost of the condo. It's $120,000 for the parking. So suddenly that condo becomes a lot more affordable if you're not forced to buy parking with it. I wish in public conversation, we could use a more stronger word than fantasy, but it is a fantasy.
All right, I think we've actually gone through the questions that have come up. And in fact, it's 2 minutes to 9. So I did want to point out a couple things before we say goodbye to Rick. First of all, tell us what your website is if people want to get on your mailing list, and perhaps you can also join as a member. Is that right?
So the website is highspeedrail.us. So that should be easy to remember, highspeedrail.us. And then if you could go down to scroll down a little bit, there's a take action button where you can send a letter to Congress. That's the most important thing you can do today, is send an email, or actually, blow in a call to their offices and say, I want trains out of this.
All right, and I'll also mention that we'll be staying in touch with Rick. He's a great source, and pass along through our emails, et cetera, to people news as we get it. I will point out that our website is westwisconsinrail.org. You can join. There's a join button there that'll for sure get you on our mailing list. We're also on Facebook, and we'll be posting this video within a few days, probably, with if you want to look at it again or recommend it to other people. Our next meeting would be on Thursday, October 21st at 8 a.m. We have our public meetings on the third Thursday at 8 o'clock a.m. And at some point in the future, we'll probably go back to doing some in-person meetings, although the advantage of this format is we can not only cover our entire region, but we have people join us actually from all over the country. I also let you know, I mentioned the Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission. Its next meeting is going to be on October 25th. At this point, we're planning an in-person meeting that afternoon in Menominee, so that we can have a little bit more time to really work on what the work of that commission is going to be. And it's still being formed in terms of bylaws and those kinds of things. Also know our friends at the Wisconsin Association of Railroad Passengers have a meeting in La Crosse, I believe, on October 23rd, for those that might be interested. And then Dave Strohmeyer just posted in the chat that Big Sky Rail has a YouTube channel. They develop some really interesting resources for their work to try to expand access to rail in Montana. So I'd recommend that to you. And then another source, if you haven't gone to it, is the Rail Passengers Association. Mark, who is our Secretary Treasurer, is one of their directors, and they have an office in Washington, and they've been also very effective in keeping everybody up to speed and working with Congress to try to get legislation moving in the right direction. Rick, do you have any closing comments for us?
I don't. I just, this is really important to the future of the country that we make this happen. So I'm glad that everybody here is interested. And, if this bill passes and we get this money, that's when the hard work begins. We need to keep it going now, but then when it passes, we've got a lot of work to do to make sure the money is used well and we are prepared for the next round.
All right. Well, Rick, thanks so much for joining us today. We wish you the best in all of the things you're working on. We'll stay in touch. And thanks to Mark for coordinating the call.